right? So I have it here as reference for me, and a lot of notes that will give you a good understanding of like, you know, like what has happened and what's happening, you know. And I think like, and of course that was written by Suzanne, and you can get it online for free, and I can share it with you too. I can share with you mine. There's a lot of notes in it and things like that, but we're going to start with Shea, and then we'll move on to Suzanne, and yeah, then we'll have a discussion.
So Howell, will you tell me when 10 minutes is up?
Yes.
That way I won't go, I'll just stop wherever I am at 10 minutes. I have spent much of my life trying to understand how the people I love and who loved me and who raised me could be such racist, nasty folk. And I have spent a lot of time thinking about that, writing about it, exploring it, and so I know a lot about the right wing in this country from a very intimate perspective. So I'm trying to think, how do we talk about that here? And the first thing I want to share is that the right wing has always been with us. Yes. Much like the poor, we've always had them. Mm-hmm. So I think a way to think about it is, let's look 100 years ago, 1925. The Jim Crow South that Zohara described was solidly in place. Mm-hmm. The South had a clear apartheid system, and it had spread that system throughout the country, so that in every single state there was an arm of the KKK. It had between 4 and 8 million members. That was coming out of a time when agriculture was mechanizing, so people were leaving the South and coming to the North. And many of us know part of the response of the North was the creation of sundown towns. It was also the time when labor was organizing inside what was now the beginnings of mass production. And with that came the private armies of the Pinkertons. So I want us to see that in 1925, much of what we are experiencing now was already in shape and working very strongly in this country. It was an ideological commitment to white supremacy. It was the creation of organizations that were well connected throughout the country. And it was the use of private military force to impose white rule and to protect capital. And that was 1925. In the 1930s, what you saw was the use of technology to amplify right-wing ideology in the form of actually Huey P. Long in the South and Father Coughlin in the North. Those of us from Michigan know an entire town was built by the donations to Father Coughlin. He had 10 million radio listeners and used his radio voice as a Catholic priest to push anti-Semitism, anti-labor, racism. And that was a part of everybody's daily listening throughout the United States. In the 1940s, when you have the emergence of fascism, you had a strong Nazi party inside the United States. That was so strong that Father Coughlin in 1939 went to Madison Square Garden, the largest gathering in the country up until that time, for a Nazi rally. And our very own Henry Ford was given the highest civilian medal by Adolf Hitler. So that we see this, and then we of course have World War II, It was a question what side the United States was going to join on. When we joined to so-called defend democracy, we did it with a segregated army. So that is our history up to World War II. After World War II, you had the ascendance of Roosevelt and the New Deal and what we think of as the progressive era, the foundations of the liberal state. The right wing never accepted the end of the Civil War. It never accepted the creation of a liberal state. What it did was begin to try to organize miserably because Roosevelt was so popular. But what they latched onto was racism, anti-immigration, and anti-communism. And those became the cornerstones of an intellectual foundation which ultimately led to the running of Barry Goldwater for president. He was defeated soundly. His famous phrase was, "Extremism in the defense of liberty is no vice. Moderation in the defense of justice is no virtue." The young men, white men, who backed Goldwater were furious at that loss, and they began to organize on a weekly basis. And their number one decision was that the intellectual elite that had provided the foundation of the conservative movement in this country had to be overturned by a mass party. So they began to systematically create mass political organizing. Suzanne and I spent about 20 minutes trying to remember Richard Viguerie, who developed the mass mailings to people that enabled the creation of what I think of as the host of anti-movements. Anti-desegregation, anti-ERA, that's the Equal Rights Amendment, anti-abortion, anti-gun control. If you look through that period, the only anti they weren't was nuclear. So that you had the use of single issues to really begin to organize a mass base. And as we were talking earlier, I think with Drew, that mass base practiced its organizing in small groups at the local level. And it included taking over school boards, taking over libraries, taking over the mechanisms of daily life in our local communities. And that taking over was rooted in direct action, and it was rooted in a clear ideology. And that ideology had 4 parts I want us to think about. The first is it believes in a hierarchical organization of society, which is ordained by God. Man at the top, everybody else down below, in a rather clear order. The second thing it believed is that critical thought is dangerous, that there is an orthodoxy of belief that must be upheld at all costs. The third thing they believed was that this has to be enforced by a strong military presence. And the fourth thing, which I've almost forgotten, was the creation of the media, that you needed an ongoing way to reinforce your ideology. So this hierarchical authoritarian ideology is held in by physical force and psychological force. So I think if we take a look at what the right wing did coming up to this point, there are 5 key areas I want you to see. First, they created a mass organizational base. Secondly, they created parallel structures. And in these parallel structures, they especially used the creation of churches. First, it was the white churches to evade desegregation, but it has evolved into what we now know to be the white Christian nationalist churches. But they didn't stop with that kind of power structure, though, or parallel structure. They also created universities. Think Liberty University. They created think tanks. Think about the Heritage Foundation, which was established in 1973. They created law schools. The current Supreme Court and the Federalist Society that brought them into being was created in the 1970s out of the Ave Maria Law School set up by Domino's Pizza. So they created these parallel structures that began to create an intellectual climate. The third thing they did was to take over political offices. The fourth was to infiltrate the military and to create paramilitary structures. Think 1995 and the Oklahoma City bombing. And then the final thing that they did was to create an alternative media source. And they have been adept at, as they were in the 1930s, in moving to the new technologies and using those new technologies for their own purposes. So when we look at the right wing today, almost everything we see has its roots in the past. And I think the article that you read by Scott Nakagawa has really wonderful ways of saying, yes, it's the past, but it's also new. The one new thing I want you to really think about was up until now, people always had somewhere else to go. People in the South could go north. People in cities could go start rural communes. There was always somewhere in America where you could find a place of safety to develop and protect your people. That is no longer true. There is nowhere that cannot be seen, watched, reached by the level of surveillance that we have. So the capacity for us to create something new really does require, to use the phrase Al Josie had earlier, we have to make a way out of no way. And I think that primary thing we should learn from the right, other than their techniques, is that they had a vision of where they want to take this country. And one of the things we have to really ask ourselves is, where do we want to be 100 years from now? Okay?